So I suppose most of you actually would recognize seeing Amy in church from sitting with her granddaughters, Sophie and Claire. And you might have seen her last night on PBS. And lately she's had a couple of essays that have been published, and I've been impressed with them too. Washington Post, the Daily Beast, another one, and two actually in the Toronto Globe and Mail. All on the subject of Ukraine, Russia. Her original area of research was the KGB back during the Soviet period. So I've actually followed her work ever since, I guess, the mid 2010s, in that range, when we started having these assassinations in London. And she's written a book about that. She knows an awful lot about the follow-up from the KGB, which gave rise to the oligarchs and also to Vladimir Putin. And so she's been asked to speak on Vladimir Putin that last couple of times for interviews on TV. She's educated at the University of Michigan and did her PhD at the London School of Economics. She's taught at Johns Hopkins and George Washington universities. Also for a long time was at the Library of Congress in Washington, which I suppose our paths might have actually crossed, because when I was writing my dissertation, I was down there a whole bunch. So who knows, in a former life. But at any rate, the format tonight is going to be simple. I've just asked if she would give us about 5 minutes of introduction based on what she kind of has seen going on in Ukraine and what she thinks is likely to unfold. But the Christchurch crowd is pretty informed, and you know what you want to talk about. And so we really want to just let you ask questions. And if we could process this in smaller discussions, we would, but probably for tonight, we'll just be asking questions to Amy and she'll be answering. And I turn it over to Amy now.
It might be a little more than 5 minutes.
That's okay.
I have trouble. So just what I, all of you, I'm sure, have been following things very closely. And what I think I can kind of bring to the table is that Chuck did mention, I mean, I've studied Russia for a long time. And I also am currently now writing a book about Putin and an oligarch named Boris Berezovsky. And so I've been going back quite a bit into sort of Putin's history, reading memoirs of other people who knew him and sort of following. And actually, it's very fascinating how he rose to power. He really was kind of a nobody, even in the KGB. And he basically was kind of handpicked by Yeltsin and his team, because Yeltsin couldn't run again. He was in bad health and he had a drinking problem, and they needed a successor who would protect the whole group of them, including Yeltsin's family, from all these corruption allegations. So Putin was sort of in the right place at the right time. He was working in the Yeltsin administration. He had worked for a long time for the KGB, and then he worked in the St. Petersburg mayor's office. So anyway, he was for 1 year head of the KGB successor, the FSB, but people didn't really know him. And so he was sort of plucked out of obscurity, and Yeltsin made this announcement: here is my new prime minister, in August 1999. And everybody was kind of scratching their heads, you know, who is this guy? Well, his popularity, approval rating was like 2% in August. But then, I don't know if you remember the Chechen War and the September apartment bombings. They were terrible. They were like Russia's 9/11. And Putin rose to the occasion. He was prime minister then, but Yeltsin had made it clear that he was his designated successor when Yeltsin was going to step down at the end of the year, or when he was going to run for re-election. Excuse me, he would have run for re-election. Anyway, so Mr. Putin basically took matters in his own hands, and he kind of assumed control of all the military operations. And he went after Chechens with a vengeance. The problem is that, and I'm going into this a little bit because it has some relevance, quite a bit of relevance, I see, to Ukraine. the excuse for a full-scale invasion by the Russian military of the Republic of Chechnya was that the Chechens had committed these horrible terrorist bombings. There were 4 of them in Russia in September. Well, as it turns out, much later, a lot of questions were raised at the time. There were no Chechen terrorists that did this, and it was a false flag operation by the Russian security services. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this, because the Russians decimated Chechnya. It was just horrible. Bombing, they bombed the whole city of Grozny. All these people had to flee. It quite similar to what we're seeing now in Mariupol and other places. But it catapulted, as I have said before, it catapulted Putin to great popularity. And basically that's why he was able to win the presidential election in March 2000. So I kind of think that when Putin made this decision to invade Ukraine for numerous reasons, but I think one of them was this feeling he's getting older. Everybody's asking him if he's going to run again in 2024, and I think a part of him looks back on that Chechen war and how he was able to really be the hero for all the Russian people. And so this is possibly one motivation. And the other is, of course, he has a fear of NATO, but it's basically because he's not a democratic leader. And autocrats are never secure in their own, of their own political support. No matter what they do with the media or anything else, they're always worried that the people are going to turn against them. And the worst thing for a non-democratic leader like Mr. Putin is to have a functioning democracy like Ukraine on Russia's doorstep. It's a big threat, particularly since the Ukrainians and the Russians are so interconnected with families and everything. So I think, Putin definitely has had a huge obsession about NATO expansion, and he wants to restore, he would love to restore Russia to the point where they had the whole Soviet Union back again. That obviously isn't going to happen. But anyway, these are some of these motivations. Now I've already gone on too long with the background. So I am going to say, well, here's one thing. So I just came across this. Russia has deployed 190,000 troops to take over Ukraine, which has a population of 40 million people. During World War II, when the Germans invaded France, also with a population of 40 million, they used 3 million troops. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't really, I've seen a lot of people say that Russia actually has quite a few troops, and they just don't seem to be doing the right thing. But I think that sort of puts things into perspective. So now we have this devastating impact on Ukraine. The humanitarian conditions within Ukraine itself are horrible. The critical national infrastructure in Ukraine is under attack. Its transport system, hospitals, communications networks have been degraded, and over 2 million Ukrainians, mainly women and children, have become refugees in neighboring countries. But the Russian military advances in Ukraine appear to have stalled in most operational theaters. The explanations for this unexpected outcome include logistical difficulties, poor planning, long and vulnerable supply lines, and the inability to execute combined arms warfare effectively. And then, of course, in places where Russia has taken territory, they have met with a hostile civil population, even in Russian-speaking areas, such as Kherson. Now, I thought this might be interesting. I get on Twitter a lot, and there are a lot of really interesting comments from Russians on Twitter, and some of them are very insightful. Up until a few days ago, I got a great deal of my information from a website called Echo of Moscow, which was also a radio station. And they have had the absolute best political experts, independent political experts, always. I mean, you wake up in the morning and there are all these people either in interviews that you can get on YouTube, or you can watch their, read their blogs. Wonderful insights and up-to-date news. Well, as you probably have heard, Echo of Moscow is no longer in Moscow. They've been completely shut down. And I mean, there's a complete news blackout really from the West. So in the past few days, I've sort of resorted to looking at Twitter if I want to just get a feel for what Russians are saying. Anyway, this is actually something that was leaked from an FSB whistleblower, fairly high up in the FSB, and it has been authenticated. So I just thought I'd just read you a couple things that he said, and this was about 4 days ago. The blitzkrieg failed. It's entirely impossible to complete the job at this point. If in the first 3 days, Zelensky and some holders of power were captured, all key buildings in Kiev were taken, and the order to surrender were given, then yes, resistance would be minimal, theoretically. But what next? Even under such ideal circumstances, there stands an unsolvable problem. Negotiate with who? If we topple Zelensky, great. Who do we deal with? If with Zelensky, then after we topple him, then the papers he signs are worthless. Today, even if we kill Zelensky, take him prisoner, nothing will change at this point. Ukraine matches Chechnya in their hatred for us. Now, even those who were loyal to us in Ukraine are standing against us. Because this was planned at the top, because we were told that there was no chance of this. Initially, we had planned on starting protests in Ukraine against Zelensky. Intruding or invading Ukraine was never a consideration. So he emphasizes in this that basically no one knew that this was happening, not even higher levels of the military and the FSB. So people were quite caught off guard. Then I also, and then I will stop and we can have questions. Of all the people that I've seen comment, I think Andrei Kozyrev, who was the foreign minister under Yeltsin and now lives in the US, you may have seen him commenting on the news. But he had a Twitter sort of analysis that I copied, because I think he makes the most sense. And I'll read through this quickly, and then we can have some questions. First of all, this is Kozyrev talking. First of all, I want to examine where the question of Putin's rationality started. I think it began because most people, particularly in the West, view his decision to invade Ukraine as utterly irrational. It's horrific. I disagree. It's horrific, but it's not irrational. Number one, Ukraine's condition. Putin spent the last 20 years believing that Ukraine is not a real nation and at best could be a satellite state. Maidan, that's the revolution in 2014, ended any hope of keeping Ukraine independent and pro-Kremlin. He thought the West was behind it. Putin always he always blamed the West for Maidan. If Ukraine's government can't be kept independent and pro-Kremlin covertly, as he likely concluded, then he will overtly force it to be. He also started to believe his own propagandists that Ukraine is run by a Nazi Bandera junta. Perfect pretext to denazify Ukraine. The Russian military. This is again Kozyrev going down this. The Kremlin spent the last 20 years trying to modernize its military. Much of that budget was stolen and spent on mega yachts in Cyprus. But as a military advisor, you can't report that to the president. So they reported lies to him instead. The West. The Russian ruling elite believed its own propaganda that President Biden is mentally inept. They also thought the EU was weak because of how toothless their sanctions were in 2014. And then the US botched its withdrawal from Afghanistan, solidifying this narrative. So if you believe all three of the above and your goal, as Putin does, is to restore the glory of the Russian Empire, whatever that means, then it's perfectly rational to invade Ukraine. Putin miscalculated on all three, but that doesn't make him insane. Given that he is rational, I strongly believe he will not intentionally use nuclear weapons against the West. And this is reassuring. I say intentionally because indiscriminate shelling near a nuclear power plant can cause an unintentional nuclear disaster in Ukraine. And we've seen some discussions of this lately. I will take it a step further. The threat of nuclear war is another example of Putin's rationality. The Kremlin knows that it can try to extract concessions, whether from Ukraine or from the West, by saber rattling its last remaining card in the deck, nuclear weapons. The ultimate conclusion here is that the West should not agree to any unilateral concessions or limit its support of Ukraine too much just because it fears nuclear war. And then final statement. I agree. Until he is pressured from within the country, Putin will probably not stop with Ukraine. So there could well be a conflict with NATO anyway. We should stop him now and save Ukrainian lives. So.
With that, we could take questions. I'm going to ask if Amy will, she's going to repeat your question for the people that are online. But shoot away. Chuck Mixon.
On your last statement about
You online.
it will not stop.
Raise your virtual hand.
Then the most probable entry could possibly be through Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, and over to Kaliningrad. Is that a possibility, do you think? Rather than go up through Poland, it would cut across there to get access to the Baltic.
Wait, entry into what country are you talking about?
They would go through from Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, and to Kaliningrad, which is on the Baltic, in order to get access to the Baltic Sea.
Well,
Amy, don't repeat questions.
the question really is how, if the Russian military were to go into a NATO country, what would be the route that they would take? I think that, and I've heard said that the first country they would move into would be Moldova, because it's not actually you were asking me about a NATO country. It is not part of NATO, but I think quite a few people feel that would be sort of the next step. I think it's difficult. I couldn't possibly predict, what their maneuvering will be, but I think that, and I also don't think that there is bound to be a conflict with NATO. If something else were to occur, that would stop this, and by that I mean there's some possibilities of pressures upon Putin from within the country, and we can talk about that. I couldn't go into it, but as you're well aware, there are huge strains now on Russia, And, it's always possible that elements within even his own government would somehow figure out a way to oppose Mr. Putin. I think street protests would take quite a while to really get started. Right now, the Russian population is pretty much on board with the Kremlin. But so that it isn't an inevitability. But to talk about which route they would take, it's just hard for me to say.
Seems like it would be the easiest way to, with the 3 countries that are recently joining NATO, that would be the obvious way to.
John.
Excuse me, the 77 people online cannot hear people in the audience, so either you have to go up to the microphone and speak, or else let Amy paraphrase what you're saying.
John, go ahead.
The comment was made that we have to stop Putin now in Ukraine. How are we going to do that? That is my question.
How are we going to stop Putin in Ukraine? Well, quite a few people feel that the Ukrainian people can continue to put up resistance to this military invasion and possibly wear down the Russian forces. And if this is drawn out long enough, then perhaps Mr. Putin will be forced to make some sort of concessions that would be amenable to the Ukrainians. I think that's really difficult to ascertain at this point, the likelihood of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people of holding out indefinite, for a long period of time. So I'm not a military expert, but I think they've done an amazing job so far. And clearly the Russian military was caught completely off guard on this. They did not expect the amount of resistance and actual skills that the Ukrainians have.
Dave.
Amy, how significant do you think it is that we had a previous president who called him a genius and was obsequious to Mr. Putin, quite frankly? And I'm in that, why did he not invade during the Trump administrations? Because we gave reasons as to why he invaded now. I'm curious because Mr. Trump obviously would have not rallied NATO.
The question is, why didn't Putin make the decision to invade Ukraine during the time that Trump was president? Well, I'm sure all of you might have your own opinions. As you know, President Trump did a good job on trying to completely deunite NATO. I mean, he basically said that it wasn't a worthwhile alliance, and he was demanding that NATO members pay more. And he really, it was quite shocking how he almost seemed deliberately to want to make this alliance very weak. I'm sure that I know that this made President Putin very happy. Because, as I mentioned, he's terrified of NATO. That's all he has been able to talk about over the past decade. So perhaps Mr. Putin was kind of waiting for things to get even worse. And since Trump was already doing his bidding, he didn't want, he wanted to sort of let things play out. The other thing is that even though Trump was always talking about Putin as such a great guy, and he and I can trust each other and all this and that, I think President Putin didn't quite know how Trump would react in the event of a challenge like what Biden is facing. So perhaps he thought that Mr. Trump was a little more unpredictable.
That's exactly exactly what you just said.
Got three questions. I'm gonna go ahead.
My question concerns your comment, I think you made, that one possibility for a end to this conflict in relatively short term might be if Putin were assassinated or overthrown, or if there was a revolt against him within the Kremlin. And my question is, how might that occur? And what are and how? No. Can you give some insight in terms of what is the Kremlin? Revolt cost?
The question is, if President Putin were to be quote unquote deposed by some means, how might that happen? Wow. Well, I do think it's very clear that the people around him, and that would include the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, even the defense minister, perhaps even Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, none of them are very happy about this invasion. I think it was quite clear on this now infamous national security meeting that Putin had televised when he was kind of announcing this new aggression. He didn't say we're going to invade, but he was talking about the Donbass and how they were going to, go in and do this and that, recognize their independence. And it's quite clear that his foreign policy advisors and his security people were not happy. But there's a big jump from not being happy to doing something about it. And, as you see, Foreign Minister Lavrov, for example, I mean, today he was, after the meeting that he had with the Ukrainian foreign minister, he was spouting off all the lies, I should say, and endorsing all of them so readily that one really kind of wonders, maybe he believes it too. I don't know. But back to the question at hand, I think it would take a coalition. In other words, one person. I don't think one person is going to go in and physically harm President Putin. That couldn't happen. What could happen would be a coalition of members of his team who would, first probably go to him and say, this isn't going well. It's a disaster. We're sanctioned and our economy is going down, all the things, the military is struggling. And why don't you get sick? Which would be a sort of a Kremlin way of doing things. And yeah. Well, no, I don't think poison. I'm thinking, persuading him that he doesn't have any choice but to get sick. And then, what would happen next? I would assume that the people who would take over would be at the very least amenable to some of the demands that Western governments are making.
Marilyn and then Jill and then Doug.
We have a couple of questions online too.
Marilyn, go ahead.
Amy, in the news, you read that the sanctions that the West has imposed so far are going to hurt the oligarchs. Could you say a little bit about the role of the oligarchs in this situation?
I was asked a question about the role of the oligarchs and how the sanctions are affecting them. That's a really good question, Marilyn. The oligarchs are not decision makers. So in the short term, this is not going to really matter to anyone but the oligarchs. I'm talking about Abramovich, who is just the Chelsea football owner, who was just personally sanctioned by the UK government today, which means he can't even go into the country. It's very painful for all these men. And you know, the list, you've seen the list of these oligarchs and their vast wealth. I have a personal kind of interest in Alpha Bank. And though they have actually not been, their directors have not been sanctioned here yet. I'm assuming it's going to come. But whether that would have any immediate effect on the decision-making that is going on in the Kremlin, that is a more difficult question. I mean, they've always had influence. They've been Putin's emissaries abroad, and they take his money and hide it away for him, and they give him money. And yes, so he's dependent on them. But in this immediate situation, I just don't know how much clout they have. Now, that said, I'll just mention Lavrov again, because for all of his anti-Western talk, and I wrote about this, Mr. Lavrov was sailing on his yacht in the Mediterranean last summer, and with his girlfriend, and he's married, but he has a lady that he likes to take on these vacations. And this
For advice.
and right. And also, you know, Lavrov, I just was thinking about this today. Lavrov's daughter, Lavrov used to be the ambassador to the UN, and he lived here for quite a while in New York. His daughter was educated, grew up practically in New York City, and was educated at Columbia, I think. So she's back in Moscow. She's an international art dealer, but you kind of wonder what she thinks. I mean, you know, the children of these people who are making these decisions, who all travel, and many of them have been educated abroad. And you kind of, I mean, you kind of wonder whether they're what they're saying. Anyway, that is going a little bit too far from your question, but.
Jill and then Deborah.
You touched on some of this, but I was interested in what you said about autocrats never feeling secure. Yet he must have people who are supporting him, and there's some sort of structure around him that is enabling this to happen. And I'm wondering if you could touch on a few more of the characters that are likely helping to hold him up, and who he might be more and less afraid of. Is that okay?
We're talking about, I guess the question was about sort of the members of Mr. Putin's team.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's difficult to say. There used to be sort of more liberal people in Putin's circle who had supposedly had influence on him. But those people don't seem to be having as much influence now, obviously. But I think that Mr. Putin, he relies a lot on people who control the security services, of course, the military, and also the National Guard, which would be that would be the soldiers who would go in, and the internal troops who would go in if there was any kind of unrest. And he has, trust me, he has very, very long time loyal allies in all of these power positions. So I don't think that, I think it would be difficult to try to persuade Putin to change course or step down without somehow getting the acquiescence of these people, and whether they're more rational. And I mean, they're all looking after their own interests. So at some point, even the most diehard former KGB men, they see the writing on the wall, and they're watching their country go down the tubes.
Paul, we're going to have Deborah, and then we'll take one from online. How about that? Go ahead.
So my question dovetails with what you just said, and I think it was former Ambassador Fall suggested that one way to get to him, to depose him, or put a crack in his, people surrounding him, is to somehow get to those people and try to persuade them over somehow to our way of thinking, or to, I'm not explaining, right, but
Using inside
yeah,
communications.
yeah.
Yes. Well, the question is,
Getting them to flip,
getting them what?
getting them to flip on him.
Right. So the question is another possible way of changing the course of events right now is to somehow have Western communication with some of these people around Mr. Putin. That's a very good question, and I've actually thought about that because we have had on occasion inside Kremlin sources, and I often wonder whether all of this intelligence that we have had about, as you know, the Biden administration was very firm that this invasion was going to happen, even though the Kremlin was saying no, no, no. And it seems to me it's possible that even beyond the cyber intelligence that we get, and obviously we have really great ability to intercept cyber communications and figure out what's going on. But I think it is possible that there is a human source, and that maybe something could be communicated. But of course, now if there isn't, at least the U.S. relations now with Russia are at the point where there's very little opportunity for any communication between other advisors of Mr. Putin.
Paul.
Okay, we have a question online from John Houston. I hope we'll be able to hear you. Go ahead, John.
Right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank Amy for doing this. And second, for all of those of you who are not members of Christ Church, come and join us on Sunday morning sometimes. And this, this is something.
Excellent.
So my question is, in listening to different newscasts, I've heard Putin described as unhinged. And the younger Putin was supposedly very calculating and basically disciplined in his ruling. What's your opinion? Do you think he's crazy?
No, I don't think, this goes back to what Andrei Kozarov said.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I don't think, if you look at sort of Putin's history and all the things that have happened during his presidency, it's not hard to see why he would be taking the course that he is, given that this is Mr. Putin, who is narcissistic, doesn't really care at all about the welfare of his people. Remember, he's allowed the oligarchs and members of the government to steal from the people to the point where their standard of living isn't very good. So this is a man who's narcissistic, has absolutely no moral principles. He's really a monster. But talking about rationality, if he has a specific goal, then and he's trying to go towards it, it's hard to say whether he's crazy or not. I mean, Hitler and Stalin were both crazy, sort of, but they managed to do a lot of devastation.
Is it reasonable to say that he's a sociopath?
Yes. Yes, I was asked if it's reasonable to say that he is a sociopath.
It also strikes me that having a little war going is a great unifying factor, and he may feel that this will help get more Russian people behind it, as long as they keep being fed misinformation about what is going on and why they are going into Ukraine and get rid of the Nazis that are there. But as people begin to get more feedback about their children who are fighting in this war, you know, the Russian soldiers that are going, and I think, you know, this is not a reasonable, rational thing for our country to be engaged in. I think it can backfire on him as a unifying thing. It seems to be unifying us a little bit, which is kind of amazing and terrible at the same time. But a bigger question is, how large is the Russian military? I know the number of troops that you have that you can send into a country makes a big difference in whether you can take over a territory just by the manpower. I have no sense of how large Russia's military actually is. You know, how many people are still in Russia?
I wish I could answer that question, and I'm sorry, because I don't like to try to, I mean, it's in the million. I don't know how many million they have, but, they certainly have, they could bring more troops in. But if they were ever, if the Russian military were ever to be really engaged with NATO, they wouldn't do as well, because I think NATO, if we actually pulled out all the stops, but again, this is kind of beyond my expertise. But so one of the questions was about that you alluded to was about the Russian people in general and being on board with Mr. Putin, and whether when some of the Russian soldiers, well, they're dying right now in pretty significant numbers, but as they continue to lose their lives, will the Russian people eventually sort of start to become very unhappy? I think, yes, the answer is yes. The question is, how long would it take? And right now, with this complete information, I mean, they have Russian people, it's never happened. I mean, since the days of Stalin, that there's been like a total news blackout. I do wonder how long this could last. And another thing is that Russian people tend to be very patriotic, and they're sort of conditioned to approve of their leader unless their leader does something really bad. And so Putin's approval ratings have always been much higher than Western leaders have, because when the polls, they're in their independent polls that go around, and they're all, yeah, he's doing a good job. But there are quite a few people, myself included, who think that this is these ratings of Mr. Putin are a little bit sort of thin, and that it wouldn't take that much to have these people change. And I think the loss of life, and also they're going to be suffering so much economically. And that's when Russians really start to talk or start to protest. It's when things hit their pocketbooks.
If they can connect it to this war, if they can connect.
They
to them, to this war in Ukraine.
I'm sure they'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, one more and then
Well,
Frank.
we have 3 more online. And then the next one is Julia O'Brien, and she's unmuted. Go ahead, Julia.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Julia.
You're not going to see me because I didn't wash my hair today. But the question is, if things get really, really bad in Ukraine for Russia, and it's apparent that they are not going to win, and they continue to have massive losses, and maybe even some NATO countries join in, what is Putin going to do? Is he going to go nuclear, or is he going to listen to reason and step aside? I mean, what do you think he will do?
Well, I don't think, I do not think that President Putin would go nuclear. It's first of all, there isn't just like a button that Putin alone could go and push or ask to be pushed. It's even though it's Russia, it's like it is here. There's a whole set of protocols, and it would require other people to be similarly suicidal. And that's what it would be, right? If you're talking about, a real use of nuclear weapons. There's the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, which has kept us out of nuclear war ever since we got the bomb. And I think that it would require more than just President Putin to be that irrational. So I don't think that we need to worry about that. And I think if things get bad enough, that the other thing is the morale of the Russian military. I mean, that's supposedly not that great anyway right now, the soldiers who are in Ukraine. And if things start to look really bad and things drag out and lives continue to be lost, then I think what we were talking about earlier, this scenario of people just going to Putin and saying, I think it's time to go back and go to bed.
Frank, after this, one more call, I guess. Frank.
This nuclear halo, that's the question for another day and another topic, and that's a very difficult one. But setting that aside, this move by the Russians makes no sense at all strategically, because even if they take over all of the former Soviet countries, they're not going to change any balance. They're not going to expect NATO. They're not going to take over. They're not going to dominate the world. I think the most important thing in this whole situation is how the West reacts to this move, and what about China? Because if you think strategically, if China starts to play the same way that Russia is playing, if a Russian-Chinese merger occurs, then it's another matter. But Russia itself, we're spending a lot of time on it, and we have to. But I think the strategic question is China. Where's China in all this?
Well, so the question is, maybe people can hear this on Zoom. The question is, Frank was saying that it's more, that there's also a strategic question looking at what the impact of Russia's relationship with China would be. Frank, are you saying if Russia continues to do badly militarily?
Russia really doesn't bother me too much, because Russia is not going to affect the West. I mean, they're creating a lot of pain and suffering, but they're not going to affect NATO or the West. They're not going to dominate the world. And so it's hard to understand why they're doing what they're doing. But if the West doesn't react in a way to make sure that you're not going to get away with this, then China comes in and acts the same way. And if a Chinese-Russian merger comes about, then we have a real problem. So I think what we really have to do in the West right now is make sure that our actions can't be misunderstood, that aggressors have got to know that they pay a steep price, and China's got to know that if they come in with Russia, they too will pay the steep price.
So the question is about China and Russia. China and Russia now, as everyone knows, have a sort of an alliance. The Chinese government has been, lamented the loss of life in Ukraine and so on and so forth, but obviously they haven't come out and condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine like Western nations have. But I don't know that I don't know that there is always a benefit for China in this conflict. I think that the Chinese leadership would probably like for this not to be happening. First of all, it's going to have an economic impact on China, just like it is the rest of the world. So in the short term, I would expect them not to kind of form a stronger strategic partnership with Russia. but rather to do whatever is possible to, put pressure on Russia to maybe figure out a way to end the conflict.
Okay, another question online from Jim Blinn. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. So I wondered if you thought that the former Germany Chancellor Angela Merkel and her personal relationship that she'd had with Vladimir Putin led to that unfortunate decision to halt nuclear power plants and lead to the pipeline and the dependence of Germany on Russian gas.
Did everybody hear that question? Okay, so the question was whether Angela Merkel, who had a relationship, she communicated with Mr. Putin. She was seen as sort of the one person in NATO, the one NATO leader who could talk to Putin. Whether she was, I guess, being too weak by allowing the Germany to turn more of its dependence on gas and these from Russia and then on nuclear power. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the decisions about nuclear power were not just only about relations with Russia. I mean, those were kind of separate, but the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been very important for both Germany and Russia. Well, it hasn't started up yet, but it's been considered, and that was going to be a stumbling block, we thought, for a while, the Biden administration, in getting Germany to cooperate in terms of reprisals against Russia for this invasion. And as it turns out, we've been quite surprised, because Scholz has been he's been very strong on this, and Germany is sacrificing quite a bit because of this pipeline was going to be very beneficial. As far as Merkel's concerned, I never thought of her as weak with Putin. She seemed to actually understand him a lot better than other leaders, and she did seem to be able to communicate with him. I don't know, what kind of advice she was giving to other NATO members all the time, but I'm certainly, in comparison to Gerhard Schroeder, Angela Merkel was, I think that she just took everything into consideration when she made decisions, but I don't think that she was weak with Russia.
We have one more.
Thank you.
Taking this back to
Good evening.
what do you think would happen if Zelensky is murdered?
Oh, sorry, we have one question from the floor here, and then I'll answer yours. I was asked what would happen if Zelensky were murdered. Well, for a long time, I thought, initially, I would have thought that would be the Russians' first goal would be to physically get rid of Mr. Zelensky. And I heard that there were several assassination attempts, but one doesn't know because these are rumors. But because it would make sense, if you want to go in and occupy a country, you can't keep the democratic leader sitting there. He has to be gone, because otherwise he would be a rallying point for more resistance on the part of the Ukrainian people. But it's interesting because here we see Zelensky making speeches and appearances. Now, of course, he's being protected. I just wonder whether if the Russians are doing that badly in Ukraine, and they realize that there's not really a chance that they can legitimately occupy the country with the acquiescence of the Ukrainian people, perhaps they might at some point make a deal with Zelensky. Today, I don't know if you saw this, but Zelensky is very unhappy because we're not establishing the no-fly zone over Ukraine. And he has said, well, maybe he'd be willing to allow the eastern portion of Ukraine, the Donbass, he'd make concessions on that, and maybe Ukraine would drop the idea of ever aspiring to join NATO. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that he would say this. He means it, but maybe there is a feeling that at some point, if things are bad enough for the Russian military, sanctions are just hitting so hard now that maybe the pressure in Russia and a little bit of willingness on Zelensky's part to make concessions, maybe they would end up not killing him.
Can I ask a question?
Good evening. My question is, what, if any, influence does the Orthodox Church in Russia have on this whole situation?
The Russian Orthodox Church enables Mr. Putin. He pretends to be, to go to church, and he appeals to the ordinary Russian people as this religious man, and he's, shows himself with the Orthodox Church leaders. They're basically puppets of Mr. Putin.
Thank you.
I have a question back here myself. I asked this question yesterday, and I'd like the group to hear the answer. I asked about Navalny and what kind of a leader would he be if he ever became the leader of Russia. But I have a second question: is why is he still alive and he's in prison? Why didn't they find an excuse to kill him?
Well, as you know, they did make a good try.
I know, now they have in prison, it really takes a piss.
And I think that the outcry now, it seems at this point that President Putin doesn't care what anybody thinks of him. And, maybe if he had his druthers, Navalny would have been killed after he came back to Russia. But I think that the outcry over the poisoning of Navalny and the fact that it was discovered that Navalny himself identified the people who poisoned him, the FSB people, and it was such a fiasco. I think that to take him and put him in prison and then kill him, I just think that probably it was decided that this was not the way to go. And what they're doing instead is they will keep filing new charges, accusing him of new crimes. They just had another trial. They've just said he did some sort of embezzlement. So what the long-term plan, if all were to go well, would be to just keep him. Remember, Khodorkovsky was in prison for a long time, over a decade. So I think that the idea would be keep him in prison and just keep charging him with new offenses.
And what kind of leader would he be if he ever became leader?
I think Navalny would be, of course, I've always thought he was absolutely wonderful because he's done such amazing things with uncovering all this corruption and everything. That foundation against corruption, it was amazing. I mean, you probably saw that video about Putin's palace, where about a year ago, before Navalny was, or just after he was sent to prison. I mean, he not only was able to really say it like it is and get to the bottom and show how corrupt the Kremlin is, but he also has a real appeal personally. He's a great speaker. He's got charisma, if I'm sorry to be trite, but really he does. So I think he would make an excellent leader of Russia. But interestingly enough, he's not that popular with the average Russian, in large part because of all the propaganda. They don't get the the truth.
That's right. We have one more question online, but it's getting late, so you decide.
Is there one more question here?
Yes, you want to take it? Okay, go ahead, Marvin Pincus, one of our guests. You can't hear me because I'm not. Marvin. I'm you, go ahead. Marvin Pincus, you just muted again, Marvin. Unmute and speak.
This is where the wine.
There you go. You're not speaking, Marvin. Maybe you can't hear me.
I've got one.
It's not working.
Amy, I've just got one question that I wanted to ask. How long do you think they're going to have, the Russians are going to be able to keep media control the way that they have? I remember when I went to Moscow in 1990, right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And over when I was asking people, because we were able to go into a lot of people's homes, it was really an unusual trip like that. And I would say, how come the Soviet Union really fell? Why, what happened? And over they said it was because of CNN. They told this story that the Americans undid the uplink on our satellites so that they could, ordinary Russians could get dish TV for free. And when they saw the standard of living and all those BMWs and Mercedes Benzes driving around Berlin, and they were driving these cruddy old cars, they knew they'd been lied to, and it was over. That's the way they described it. And I've been surprised that they've been able to control in our internet age. And I understand that they can knock down the internet for a little while, but eventually, how can they keep that media control?
Well, they've literally shut down, like I mentioned, Echo of Moscow and TV Rain, which were independent, which would give you the real truth about things. So Russian people right now in the country, as far as I can tell, they only have access to state-controlled Russian television. And that's why they believe that this is just an anti-terrorist operation to get rid of Nazis. They had somebody on the TV today who called a Ukrainian call up his mother in Russia, or his father, and his father didn't believe. No, what are you talking about? Now, how long that can go on is difficult to say, because I mean, the Russian government could continue to say, no, 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 there's a blackout. But the problem is the commercial and economic effect of it is just untenable. I mean, that's where it really would hurt. I mean, when you think about all the necessary, I mean, I'm not just talking about whether they could hear CNN, but right now they've blacked out everything, including, parts of the internet. And this will have a longer term effect. And I think they can't keep it up. And the other thing is that the younger people, the ones who would be out rooting for Mr. Navalny and going out on the streets right now, they depend on the internet. They get their news, like most young people here, from the internet. The older people watch television. So it's kind of, half and half. But now, even, the internet is sort of being shut down. Although I'm told that if you're savvy, and a lot of young Russians are very computer savvy, they can get these they can figure out ways. But yeah, it's not quite the same as when a few months ago, when you could really hear different points of view if you wanted to.
We'll take one more question, and then I think we'll wrap this up for tonight. Go ahead.
So months from now, the Ukraine has fallen, and the country is decimated, it's in terrible shape, but Russia has been successful. Do we keep all our sanctions in place? What do we do next?
Do we keep all of our sanctions in place if, in the event that Russia is successful and 6 months from now, they have occupied Ukraine, a decimated country? Yes, I'm quite sure that if that happens, then our NATO's goal will be regime change in Russia. And the only way that's going to happen is to keep on punishing. And remember the sanctions that were issued in 2014 after the Crimea takeover invasion. I'm pretty sure most of those stayed in place because they never gave back Crimea to Ukraine. So no, I think those sanctions will stay. And I have to say that that's another thing that Putin and his team underestimated, which was the determination of the Biden administration and their incredible efforts they went to get united NATO. I think it's very impressive, and I think in the end it's the sanctions that are going to do Mr. Putin in.
I want to honor Amy's time. I thank you for coming out tonight, and to let you know, we'll probably do this again in a month because I doubt this whole thing is going to go away then. And really, thanks so much for making time for us.
My pleasure.